Tecumseh's Confederacy and its British allies were defeated by the Americans at the Battle of the Thames, sometimes called the Battle of Moraviantown, during the War of 1812. It happened in Upper Canada, close to Chatham, on October 5, 1813. The conflict resulted in Tecumseh's death and the general disintegration of his Confederacy, which cost the British control of Southwestern Ontario. Detroit had been controlled by British forces led by Major General Henry Proctor until the U.S. Navy took control of Lake Erie and cut off their supplies. The Shawnee commander Tecumseh and his supporters, the Tribal Confederacy, followed Proctor's forced withdrawal north along the Thames River to Moraviantown. Major General William Henry Harrison's American soldiers and cavalry beat the British after driving them out, and the indigenous peoples were disheartened by Tecumseh's death in battle. The Tribe Confederacy fell, American rule was restored in the Detroit region, and Proctor was court-martialed for his subpar leadership. During the final months of 1812 and a large portion of 1813, the American Army of the Northwest, led by Major General William Henry Harrison, was trying to retake Fort Detroit and take Fort Malden at Amherstburg, Ontario, from the British Army's Right Division in Upper Canada, which was led by Major General Henry Proctor. Since the sparsely populated area produced insufficient crops and cattle to feed Proctor's troops, the sailors of the British ships on the lake, and the numerous Indians and their families assembled at Amherstburg under Tecumseh, the British position hinged on retaining control of Lake Erie. The only practical way to get supplies to them was by sea, generally from Long Point, which is close to Lake Erie's eastern shore. The Americans might put an army on the north shore and block off Proctor from reinforcements from the east if they were given naval command of Lake Erie. From the beginning of the war until the end of July 1813, British armed warships had been in possession of the lake. At Presque Isle Bay, the U.S. Navy was building its own squadron under the direction of Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry. Commander Robert Harriet, Barclay's British forces held the Americans confined on Presque Isle throughout July, but they had to break the siege for 2 days in order to get supplies. Barclay failed to assault Perry's ships, which he managed to maneuver around the sandbar at the harbor entrance and into the lake. As soon as Perry's ships were manned and equipped, his superior squadron established a counter-blockade on Amherstburg, and food supplies quickly ran out. On September 10th, with supplies nearly depleted, Barclay set out to engage Perry in combat. Nevertheless, Perry won the Battle of Lake Erie handily. "We have met the enemy, and they are ours," was the hurried message Perry wrote to General Harrison. Harrison ordered an advance because he knew Proctor would have to back off. After repairing any damage sustained during the engagement, Perry's ships sent 2,500 foot soldiers to Detroit and to Amherstburg, while 1,000 mounted forces started to advance along the lake coast. Even before learning of Barclay's defeat, Proctor had prepared to return to the British position at Burlington Heights at the western end of Lake Ontario, and Tecumseh was aware that this would eliminate any defense from the Confederation tribes whose territories were located west of Detroit. He tried to talk Proctor out of it. "We know they have battled. Our fleet has left. Although we have heard the tremendous cannons, we are unaware of our father's situation. In 1809, Barclay lost one arm. We are shocked to find our father, Proctor, tying up everything and getting ready to run the other ship without telling his red offspring what he intends to do. Our ships have already gone one way. Our father's behavior must be compared to that of a fat animal that carries its tail on its back but drops it between its legs and flees when frightened. However, there was no food, and the cannons had been taken out of the fort to be placed aboard Barclay's ships. Thus, Proctor was unable to hold Fort Amherstburg. On September 27th, he started to withdraw up the Thames River. Tecumseh was forced to accompany him. Evidently, Proctor consented to a solution that would limit the withdrawal to Moraviantown, a community of Lenape Indians who had immigrated from the United States. Being the highest point on the river that could be navigated, it was protected from water outflanking maneuvers. Additionally, despite the extremely bad roads, some supplies could be transported there by land from Burlington Heights. Proctor didn't try to strengthen this stance, though. The men were given half rations, and the British withdrawal was poorly coordinated. Proctor reportedly led the withdrawal with his wife and family, the other ladies and dependents, and his personal belongings while abandoning the main body of his troops, which was commanded by Colonel Augustus Warburton of the 41st Regiment, without instructions. Tecumseh's warriors were growing more irritated with Proctor for his refusal to halt in battle, and the British soldiers were losing heart. The Americans left 2 brigades, one under Lewis Cass to garrison Sandwich, Ontario, and another under Duncan MacArthur to garrison Detroit. On October 2nd, Harrison led Sandwich's main body in a chase after Proctor. Harrison's forces seized a number of derelict boats and a constant flow of British stragglers as they advanced. Late on October 4th, they overtook the Indians and British who were fleeing. In an attempt to halt the Americans' march, Tecumseh engaged in combat with them close to Chatham, Ontario, but the Indians were soon routed. An American raiding group grabbed the boats that were transporting Warburton's last food and munitions when they came aground. There were at least 3,500 infantrymen and cavalrymen in William Henry Harrison's troop. He had 5 battalions of Kentucky militia under the command of Isaac Shelby, a 63-year-old governor of Kentucky and a hero of the American Revolutionary War, and a small contingent of regulars from the 27th U.S. Infantry. Under Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson, he had 1,000 cavalry volunteers. Some of Johnson's men were from the River Raisin region of Michigan, but the majority were from Kentucky. They were all motivated by the catchphrase, "Remember the River Raisin." About 800 troops, mostly from the 41st Regiment, served at Proctor. Having fought in Canada since 1803, the veterans of the regiment's 1st Battalion had sustained significant losses in a number of battles in 1813, notably the Battle of Lake Erie, when over 150 of its soldiers had been on board Barclay's ships. The young troops of the 2nd Battalion had joined them. The next in seniority, Colonel Warburton, would not accept any attempt to remove Proctor from command, despite the fact that the majority of the regiment's officers were unhappy with his leadership. About 500 Indians were headed by Tecumseh. Shortly after dawn on October 5th, Proctor ordered his soldiers to drop their half-cooked meal and retire another 2 miles before forming a line of battle with a single 6-pounder gun. He intended to trap Harrison on the banks of the Thames and use cannon fire to drive the Americans off the road, but he had not tried to fortify the position by erecting earthworks or abatis, and the ground did not impede the American horsemen, and the British fire was obscured by a few scattered trees. On the British right, Tecumseh's soldiers lined up in a swamp of black ash to flank the Americans. Before returning to his soldiers, Tecumseh shook hands with each officer as he rode along the British line. After surveying the battlefield, General Harrison gave the order for James Johnson, Colonel Johnson's brother, to lead his mounted riflemen in a frontal assault on the British regulars. The British cannon did not fire, but Johnson's Kentuckians broke through despite flanking Indian fire. After firing a single ragged fusillade, the fatigued, disheartened, and half-starved British regulars fled in chaos. While the remainder of his soldiers downed their guns and submitted, Proctor and perhaps 250 of his men escaped the battlefield. On the right of the British line, where the terrain was swampy and more heavily forested, the majority of the British men who managed to flee the battlefield were members of Lieutenant Richard Bullock's Grenadier Company. Tecumseh stayed and continued to battle with his people. To divert attention from the main American force, Colonel Johnson led a group of perhaps 20 horses into the Indian position. However, Tecumseh and his troops responded with a barrage of musket fire, which put an end to the cavalry attack. Johnson was struck 5 times. His main force became stuck in the marsh muck, and 15 of his men were killed or injured. It is thought that Tecumseh was slain in this battle. James Johnson's forces were released from their assault on the British when the main army passed through the marsh. As Tecumseh's death became known, Indian resistance decreased and the American troops began to converge. Despite the lack of proof, Richard Mentor Johnson was given credit for shooting Tecumseh. He is also said to have been killed by Revolutionary War veteran William Whitley. In his memoirs Single-Handed, 1927, lawyer and one-armed marksman James A. Drains Sr. described how Whitley's granddaughter had told him about the family custom that Whitley and Tecumseh murdered each other at the same time. Harrison stated that 33 dead Indians were discovered in the woods following the battle, whereas the Indians reported 16 dead, including Tecumseh. In a letter dated October 23, 1813, General Proctor stated, "The death of Roundhead was a serious loss to both the Indian cause and ours. To get keepsakes, American troops skinned and scalped several of the slain Indians. The American defeat in the fight has been reported in a variety of ways. Harrison said that 17 people were injured, 5 died from wounds, and 7 were killed outright. According to Major General Isaac Shelby, around 20 people were injured, 4 people died from their wounds. and 7 or 8 people were slain outright. Robert McAfee, a participant, reported 10 dead and 35 injured, although Peter Trisler Jr. reported 14 killed and 20 wounded.